Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 14 in a series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. My goal is for each episode to stand on its own, but if you want the full context of this story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. I want to start out this week with just a few brief notes about the show. Some of you may recall that back in episode 1, I told you that after a series of preliminary episodes to introduce the background of the Soviet Union's history, I was going to zoom in and provide more detail on various causes of its decline and fall. Well, we're now past what I consider to be those preliminary episodes, and we're moving into phase 2 of this series. Up to now, I have more or less gone in chronological order from the revolution up to the death of Stalin. Going forward, I will try to continue to move roughly in chronological order, but since I will be zooming in to look at different events, many of which were happening simultaneously, there will be significantly more chronological overlap between episodes. Some of you may be wondering when this series is going to end, and the answer to that is, I don't know. But it's going to be a while. I have determined that I'm going to take you a little bit beyond the formal collapse of the USSR in 1991 and focus for at least a couple episodes on its aftermath, culminating in the rise of Vladimir Putin to the Russian presidency in 1999. Given how many episodes it has taken us to get this far, I think you can look forward to many more episodes before we reach the end of history. Last time, I covered the death of Joseph Stalin, the power struggle between his deputies, and the unexpected rise of Nikita Khrushchev to the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This week, I'm going to take a closer look at Nikita Khrushchev in an attempt to peel back the layers and understand this fascinating and pivotal individual, who he was, what he believed, and what his strategies were for achieving his ends. This is The End of History, Part 14. When I was a brand new baby lawyer and my first real person job after law school, I was an associate in a small general practice law firm, focusing on criminal defense. One of the first clients I was assigned to represent was accused of armed robbery. He was probably guilty, but that's something I never spent too much time thinking about as a defense attorney. Whether my client was guilty or innocent, my job was the same: to represent their interests and secure the best possible outcome in their case. In some cases, this meant fighting tooth and nail to the bitter end, and in others, most of the time in fact, this meant securing a plea agreement with a more favorable sentence. I think it's a common misconception in the wider public, especially among those who watch a lot of lawyer court TV shows and movies, that the job of a defense attorney is either to prove their client's innocence or, more cynically, to ensure that the guilty walk free. What we really do in most cases is ensure that our clients' fundamental rights are respected, and that the prosecution, in seeking to prove their case, follows all of the rules that have been put in place to protect those rights. In my experience, if the prosecution has enough evidence to prove the suspect's guilt, and the police and prosecutors follow the law throughout the process, even the slyest, most silver-tongued, expensive team of defense attorneys will not be able to secure an acquittal in that case. An important part of the criminal process that happens in almost every criminal case, in the United States and in many other countries as well, that sometimes determines whether a case goes to trial or gets pled out, is the pre-trial motions. These motions can be made either by the prosecution or the defense, and they ask the judge to decide on a variety of issues, including evidentiary issues. That is, the judge will decide whether the jury will be allowed to see a particular piece of evidence or hear a particular piece of testimony from a witness. If the evidence is illegal or deemed unreliable or prejudicial, the judge can throw it out. Going back to my armed robbery case, the most damning piece of evidence in that case was the fact that an eyewitness had identified my client as the culprit. I was tasked with making a written motion to the court to exclude that eyewitness identification as unreliable and unduly prejudicial against my client. In layman's terms, that means I was arguing that the eyewitness's recollection and identification should not be believed, but was likely to be believed by the members of a jury, and that if a jury were to see it or hear about it, it would determine their decision. regardless of what the other evidence showed. A huge part of my argument was based on the scientific unreliability of human memory. I learned a lot doing the research for that motion, a lot of which stuck with me. I cited to a number of studies that show just about everybody's memory is deeply, deeply flawed. That includes my memory and your memory. There are a lot of factors that can affect a person's memory of a particular event. For instance, if a perpetrator used a weapon in the commission of the crime, the person's focus is often, understandably, on the weapon rather than the suspect. And they're less likely to be able to accurately recall the suspect's appearance because the weapon is more prominent in their mind. By far the most powerful factor that can affect our memory is suggestion. If a police officer or prosecutor even subtly suggests to an eyewitness that a suspect looked a certain way, or suggests that a particular suspect in the lineup is guilty, this can affect how that person remembers the suspect's appearance. This can happen in other contexts too. It's not just in the courtroom, and it can result in misremembering of events from the past on a massive scale. And it leads to a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the study of history. So much of the study of history relies on eyewitness accounts to tell us what happened. When I first embarked on this project to tell the story of the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, I had a conversation with my dad, who lived through the height of the Cold War. He told me how surprised he was when the Soviet Empire seemingly suddenly unraveled in the late 80s and early 90s, as it had always seemed so formidable, and from the perspective of an American boy growing up with the prospect of nuclear apocalypse hanging over the world, very scary. He recalled one event in particular that to him symbolized what made the Soviet Union seem so frightening: the image of Nikita Khrushchev losing his temper and banging his shoe on a table at a meeting of the UN General Assembly. And just in case it seems like I'm throwing my father under the bus here, this is something a lot of people, including people who were there, remember him doing. Even Khrushchev himself recalled the event in his memoirs. The New York Times and the Washington Post both reported that Khrushchev removed his shoe and banged it on the table to get the attention of the chamber during a particularly heated session of the General Assembly discussing decolonization on October 12, 1960. The ambassador from the Philippines, Lorenzo Sumulong, in the middle of his speech, he began to make reference to, quote, "the peoples of Eastern Europe and elsewhere which have been deprived of the free exercise of their civil and political rights, and which have been swallowed up, so to speak, by the Soviet Union," end quote. At this point, according to the Times and the Post, as well as several witnesses who were present in the room, Khrushchev began yelling and pounding his fists on the table to interrupt Sumulong and gain the floor to rebut the accusation. When pounding his fists on the table failed to garner sufficient attention from the body, he allegedly removed his shoe, waved it around in the air, and proceeded to start banging it on the table to gain the attention of the body. Eventually, he made such a scene that he was recognized on the floor, and he gave a fiery speech about the hypocrisy of the West when it came to decolonization. He also attacked Sumulong personally, calling him, quote, "a jerk, a stooge, a lackey, and a toady of American imperialism," end quote. It's beyond dispute that Khrushchev was visibly angry, and he made a scene that I think could accurately be described as a tantrum. But the bit about the shoe is hotly disputed. Though many eyewitnesses report that he banged his shoe on the table, others who were there stated they had no memory of Khrushchev removing his shoe, much less banging it on the table. Still others say that his shoe had been knocked off accidentally before the incident, and rather than bending down to put it back on, Khrushchev simply placed it on his desk. Some, but not all of these witnesses say they remember him picking it up and waving it around, but not banging it on the table. None of the videos in the UN archives show Khrushchev picking up his shoe or banging it on the desk, the altered videos floating around on the internet notwithstanding. There are some still photographs in existence that do not appear to be altered, which show Khrushchev holding his shoe and the shoe sitting on the desk, but do not show conclusively that he banged it on the desk. Khrushchev himself recalled doing it, but his recollection was that he did it in a different meeting and for a different reason, a meeting in which no witnesses recall Khrushchev doing anything with his shoe. At best, Khrushchev likely misremembered events, as he wrote his memoirs toward the end of his life. It also doesn't help matters that later official Soviet histories embraced the story of the shoe banging, as it was used by Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev, and his allies to justify the coup that ousted Khrushchev. They characterized the outburst as an embarrassment to the Soviet Union and unbecoming of a General Secretary of the Communist Party. It's probable that the memories of the eyewitnesses to this event, or lack thereof, were manipulated by suggestion or other factors that affected the way they remembered it. Whether he banged his shoe on the table or not, the act became an important part of Khrushchev's legend, and framed how he and his country were perceived around the world. Thus my dad's comment that he made the Soviet Union seem scary. But who was this scary guy that may or may not have banged his shoe on a table at the UN? What did he believe? What motivated him? And what did he want? The truth is that Khrushchev was a terribly formidable man. He could come across as a very intimidating presence, and at times it's clear that this was very intentional. But Nikita Khrushchev was also a deeply complicated man. And though it is easy to find fault with some of his beliefs and actions, it is also sometimes incredibly difficult not to sympathize and even admire him. Born in the small peasant village of Kalinovka in the Kursk region of western Russia on April 15, 1894, young Nikita grew up poor. From a young age, he was put in charge of tending the family's livestock, splitting his time between part-time schooling and tending to the herd. He received only 4 years of formal education in the village school. His family could afford no more than that, but he was blessed with natural intelligence and a curious mind. The village school teacher, Lydia Shevchenko, was an early mentor to him, and in his memoirs, Khrushchev described her as a free thinker, and he recalled that she shocked the village by refusing to attend church. He also credited her with opening his mind by encouraging him to read and providing him with books that had been banned by the Tsarist government. She encouraged young Nikita to continue his education, but Khrushchev later said that his family had run out of money, and his father did not see the value of education. He later recalled that his father, Sergei Khrushchev, pulled him from school as soon as he could count to 30. Khrushchev wrote, quote, "He said that all I needed was to be able to count money, and I would never have more than 30 rubles to count anyway." End quote. Unable to make a sufficient living to support the family by farming, Sergei Khrushchev migrated to the industrial Donbass region of eastern Ukraine when Nikita was still very young. He bounced from job to job, working as a railroad worker, bricklayer, and miner, sending money back to Kalinovka to support the family, and only very rarely visiting. In 1908, at the age of 14, Nikita followed his father to Donbass, arriving in the city of Yuzovka, modern Donetsk, Ukraine. After bouncing around between jobs for a while, he eventually secured an apprenticeship with a metal fitter. After completing his apprenticeship, he secured employment as a metal fitter in a local factory. He enjoyed the work, expressing a great deal of pride in his growing skill, and he showed the first signs of his characteristic charm, making many friends among his fellow factory workers. The factories and mines of the Donbass region were, at this time, hotbeds of revolutionary activity, and it's here that Khrushchev first encountered radical politics. In 1912, Tsarist soldiers opened fire on striking gold miners in the Lena region of Siberia, sparking outrage throughout the country. Khrushchev was reported to the authorities for raising money for the families of the dead miners, and as a result, he was fired from his job at the factory. Due to the high demand for his skill as a metal fitter, he was quickly hired to work in an underground mine, repairing mechanical equipment. Though, as a skilled worker, Khrushchev was better off than many of the common laborers in the mine, he still struggled to get by and lived in relative squalor. What he saw and experienced working in the mines of Donbass only further radicalized him and drew him in the direction of socialism. In 1958, he recalled, quote, "It seemed to me that Karl Marx had actually been at the mines and based his laws on what we observed of our lives." End quote. Unlike Lenin, who came from privilege, and Stalin, who escaped into the seminary and never had to experience the struggles of the working poor, Khrushchev was a true proletarian. Marx's critiques of the plight of the workers under capitalism were not theoretical to Khrushchev. He had lived it. Thus, While all three were dedicated communists, Khrushchev was a very different kind of communist from his two predecessors. Though he was highly intelligent, Khrushchev was not an intellectual. He concerned himself very little with the esoteric communist doctrine. He was a nuts and bolts, point A to point B kind of guy. His main concern was always to build a practical revolution, a revolution that improved the economic conditions of the working class and achieved tangible results in bringing about an equal, classless society. His methods were often misguided and poorly executed, but everything I have read about him tells me that he never lost sight of this goal. When World War I broke out in 1914, though he was of prime military age, Khrushchev was exempted from the draft because his skilled work was deemed vital to the war effort. He stated his position in the mine. In 1915, he married the daughter of a fellow mine worker, Yefrosinia Pisareva, and they had two children together, a daughter, Yulia, born in 1915, and a son, Leonid, born in 1917. Throughout the First World War, he continued as before, agitating for socialism and working to organize the workers in his mine. At this time, he did not join or identify with any particular socialist party. As I said, he cared little for matters of theory or doctrine, and he was primarily concerned with results. In 1917, when the Tsar was overthrown, Khrushchev enthusiastically embraced the revolution. In May 1917, his fellow mine workers elected him as the chairman of his local Soviet. Khrushchev biographer William Taubman speculates that Khrushchev likely identified more with the Mensheviks than the Bolsheviks at this time, though he did not join either party. After the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution, Khrushchev retroactively supported it, likely coming to the practical conclusion that the Bolsheviks were now in the best position to effectively fight back the forces of counter-revolution. He officially joined the party in 1918. In late 1918, he was mobilized into the Red Army as a political commissar. I have talked briefly about political commissars in previous episodes. Essentially, it was their job to accompany the troops into battle and provide them with the proper political motivation to fight. Khrushchev's charm and persuasiveness, in addition to his insistence on sharing in the hardships of ordinary soldiers, made him exceptionally well suited to this position. Over 3 years, he spent a great deal of time with the army at the front and came under fire numerous times, which he rarely talked about in detail. While he was away at the front in 1919, his wife Yefrosinia passed away from typhus while staying with his mother in his birth village of Kalinovka. Keeping to his atheist Marxist principles, Khrushchev shocked the village by refusing to allow his wife's coffin to pass through the church, instead carrying it over a fence and around the church to the graveyard. In 1925, Lazar Kaganovich, a friend and associate of Khrushchev's, became the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party and brought Khrushchev under his patronage, facilitating a rapid rise through the ranks of the party in Ukraine. In 1929, Khrushchev followed Kaganovich, who had been appointed to the Politburo in 1926, to Moscow and secured permission to finally continue his education, and he enrolled at the Stalin Industrial Academy. He was not a particularly good student, and he would never graduate. He was, however, very successful in school politics, maneuvering to become the head of the Academy's party organization. He used this position as a springboard to become the party boss of Moscow's largest neighborhood. In 1934, he became the boss of the Moscow Communist Party, and was also named to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. As he advanced his career and moved closer to the top of the Communist Party, Khrushchev was forced to make many moral compromises. He was not just complicit, but an active and willing participant in some of the worst repressions of the Stalinist regime. As Moscow party boss, he was responsible for overseeing the construction of the Moscow Metro, which utilized the slave labor of Gulag prisoners, hundreds of whom were killed or permanently disfigured during the construction. During the years of the purges, he denounced his colleagues and ordered the arrest and/or execution of innocent people as much as any other high-ranking party member during that time. Though he later expressed that he disapproved of the purges and actively sought to repair some of the damage done by them, he had no problem at the time not only participating in them, but using them as a self-serving vehicle to eliminate personal rivals and advance his own career. To the end of his days, Khrushchev remained unapologetic. He never acknowledged and certainly never apologized for his role in the purges and other Stalinist repressions. But this guilt is, in my opinion, a double-edged sword. Were it not for his guilt and complicity in the crimes of Stalin, Khrushchev never would have been able to worm his way into the inner circle. He would have been unable to enact the reforms he did, which led the Soviet Union down a more moderate path, and power almost certainly would have fallen into the hands of someone much, much worse, probably Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police, who I talked about briefly last time. In 1937, Stalin appointed Khrushchev as the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, sending him to Kyiv to run party affairs in the Republic, where he remained, holding the Republic beneath Stalin's heel until the invasion by Nazi Germany in 1941. When he arrived in Kyiv in the true fashion of a Stalinist lieutenant, Khrushchev purged the Ukrainian party leadership, many of whom were arrested or summarily executed for mostly imagined crimes, though Khrushchev would defensively maintain for the rest of his life that these party officials were guilty of crimes against the state, and his actions had been necessary. He replaced those purged party officials with underlings whose loyalty he felt he could be sure of, and in this way consolidated his control over the Communist Party of Ukraine. In January 1938, he was made a candidate member of the Politburo and was granted full membership in March 1939, taking the final step into Stalin's inner circle. When war came to the Soviet Union in June 1941, as I talked about back in episode 7, nobody but Stalin was really surprised by it. Khrushchev spent the last months before the war started working feverishly alongside Georgy Zhukov, a man with whom he had a complicated but mostly positive working relationship at the time, to do what he could to shore up Ukraine's defenses within the bounds of Stalin's often contradictory orders. It wasn't enough, and both men knew it. But Khrushchev, at least, was still surprised when the invasion came at just how unprepared the Red Army was. He explained in his memoirs that he had focused his efforts on macro-level preparations, like the construction of defensive fortifications, but it never even occurred to him to micromanage logistics. He said, for instance, that it never occurred to him that the army would turn out to be so lacking in things so basic as rifle ammunition. But they were. It is one of the few times throughout his memoirs where Khrushchev actually admits to a mistake. After Ukraine was overrun and occupied by the Germans, it no longer made sense to Stalin to keep such a high-ranking Politburo member in charge of a republic where the Soviets no longer had any effective control. He reassigned Khrushchev to the Red Army, where he took over the position of chief political commissar for the Southwestern Front, which included the area of operations around Stalingrad. The years of war left indelible marks on Khrushchev. He saw the war up close, including serving an important role in the Battle of Stalingrad, which I discussed in episode 8. I have talked in the past about my impressions of Hollywood historical movies, and in particular the 2001 film Enemy at the Gates, which depicts the Battle of Stalingrad. On one hand, I appreciate this movie for portraying a time and place that is not usually shown to Western audiences. On the other hand, it's riddled with historical inaccuracies. Not least among them is its portrayal of Khrushchev. He is shown as an out-of-touch, pitiless oaf who lives in comfort eating caviar away from the front lines while common soldiers suffer. In fact, Khrushchev spent most of the battle inside the city, living in a hillside bunker and sharing in the hardships of the soldiers. When he did leave the front, it was always temporary and usually done for the purpose of meeting with Stalin or members of the Politburo to secure supplies, ammunition, and other things that the army needed to survive. He did often make decisions that sent soldiers to their deaths, but we know from his memoirs that he did not take these decisions lightly. And though he always felt these sacrifices were necessary, he was still deeply troubled by them. Khrushchev's eldest son, Leonid, affectionately known as Lyonya by friends and family, was also killed in the war. A fighter pilot in the Red Air Force, Leonid's plane was shot down in 1943, and his body was never recovered. Khrushchev rarely talked about the loss of his son and mentioned it only in passing in his memoir, stating, quote, "Leonid, who was a pilot, died in battle. It was a war, and many good men died, as they do in every war." End quote. As he said, it was a war, and people were dying every day. Though the loss of his son undoubtedly affected him, a man in his position could not be seen to grieve publicly for one man while surrounded by so much death. His experience in the war greatly colored his later attitude toward the United States and other Western adversaries in the context of the Cold War. Whatever his ideological differences with them might be, and as a dedicated communist he had many, he was determined that peaceful coexistence was preferable to war under almost any circumstances. He knew what war was. He had seen it up close, experienced it, lost a son to it. It was not an abstract concept to him, but a lived reality, one he had no desire to repeat. He would later write of his interactions with President Dwight Eisenhower of the United States, who had been Supreme Commander of the Western Allied forces in the war, with great respect. He felt that the two of them were kindred spirits in this respect. They both knew what war was, and whatever their differences, they were both acting in good faith to reach agreements to prevent it. After most of Ukraine was liberated by the Red Army in 1944, Khrushchev returned to his post in Kyiv as first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party. As I discussed in episode 12, Ukraine in the aftermath of the war was a mess, and Khrushchev was tasked with cleaning it up. I already discussed at length in episode 12 the famine that gripped Ukraine in 1946 and 1947. Khrushchev attempted to stand up to Stalin to prevent this unnecessary suffering, which resulted in him briefly falling from Stalin's favor and suffering political consequences. For a while it seemed as though he would soon be purged and arrested. But he endured, and though Stalin sent lackeys to keep an eye on him, second-guess him, and undermine his leadership in Ukraine, the arrest that he was probably bracing himself for never came. Eventually, Stalin forgot about the whole thing, and they resumed business as usual. Some of you may recall that back in episode 7, I talked about the partisan bands of Ukrainian nationalists who rose up against both Soviet and Nazi occupation following the start of World War II. These bands, in particular a group known as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, did not simply melt away or give up when the Soviets reasserted control over Ukraine, and many of them continued their guerrilla war against the Soviet Union well into the 1950s. These groups had no foreign support and waning support from the civilian population, which was tired of war and ready to embrace peace at almost any price. So they were never a legitimate threat to the establishment of Soviet power in Ukraine, but they were a consistent thorn in the side of Khrushchev, who was tasked with leading the effort to root out and crush them. By the time Khrushchev was recalled to Moscow in 1949, the job was mostly finished, but it was left to Khrushchev's successor as first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Leonid Melenkov, to mop up the last pockets of resistance. In December 1949, Stalin recalled Khrushchev to Moscow, where he once again assumed the role of party boss of Moscow and the surrounding region. It's unclear exactly why he was recalled to Moscow. Khrushchev himself attributed it to, quote, a sort of mental illness by Stalin, end quote. He relayed a story where Stalin recalled him because he needed a trustworthy lieutenant to help him hunt down potential conspirators in Moscow, as he had done in Leningrad earlier that year. He said that Stalin gave him a document containing a list of names that had been given to him, accusing them of a vast conspiracy against Stalin. Khrushchev wrote in his memoirs that he ignored the document for as long as he could, and then when Stalin brought it up, he told Stalin it was nonsense, and Stalin, trusting his judgment, let the matter go. While there's nothing beyond Khrushchev's word to corroborate this account, I find it plausible. Khrushchev did have a record of standing up to Stalin, carefully and tactfully, when he thought he was wrong. And it does seem like Stalin truly trusted Khrushchev and even appreciated his willingness to level with him and tell him unpleasant truths. Khrushchev biographer William Taubman speculates that Stalin may have brought Khrushchev into the inner circle to undermine and act as a counterweight to the growing power of Georgy Malenkov and Lavrentiy Beria, neither of whom he completely trusted. Whatever Stalin's reasons were, he brought Khrushchev to Moscow and made him an important part of his inner circle, which is where he was when Stalin died in March 1953. I covered the events of Stalin's death and the ensuing struggle for power last week, so I won't revisit that here except to say that Khrushchev successfully campaigned to neutralize Malenkov and eliminate Beria, who was executed in December 1953. Following the execution of Beria, Khrushchev continued to isolate Malenkov. Starting in February 1954, Khrushchev replaced him in the seat of honor at the head of meetings of the Presidium, and in January 1955, Malenkov was formally accused of various atrocities and complicity in the crimes of Beria. Incredibly hypocritically, Khrushchev even dared to denounce him for his role in the 1949 Leningrad affair. You will recall from episode 12 that Khrushchev's signature also appeared on the documents authorizing the crackdown on Leningrad party leaders. Unlike Beria, who was arrested and executed, Malenkov's fall had a pretty soft landing. He retained his seat on the party's Central Committee, and even his title as Minister of Electric Power Stations, but he was stripped of most of his important leadership posts in the party, and was sufficiently diminished so that there was no longer any doubt that Nikita Khrushchev stood supreme as the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. It's important to note that while he was the most powerful individual in an authoritarian state, he was not a dictator as Stalin had been. His position relied not on fear, as Stalin's had, but on holding the loyalty of the Communist Party leadership as well as rank-and-file party members. His opinion carried a great deal of weight, but it was possible for him to be overruled, and the Politburo and Central Committee had to be convinced that the courses of action he had chosen were wise and correct. By February 1956, however, he felt secure enough in his position to do something that had previously been unthinkable. He was ready to denounce Stalin, his cult of personality, and the terror of his purges. Initially, he wanted to do so publicly before the entire country, but was persuaded by advisors to do so in a much more limited way, at a closed session of the 20th Communist Party Congress in Moscow on February 25, 1956. In the so-called secret speech, Khrushchev railed against the cult of personality as an unfortunate detour from the true democratic principles of Marxism-Leninism. He revisited Lenin's testament, criticizing Stalin, and quoted other early party members who had been close to Lenin and expressed their distaste for Stalin. Finally, he tore into the terror of the purges, proclaiming that many of the victims of the purges had been innocent and arbitrarily denounced and killed by Stalin. He stated in part, quote, "Stalin originated the concept enemy of the people. This term automatically made it unnecessary that the ideological errors of a man or men engaged in a controversy be proven. It made possible the use of the cruelest repression, violating all norms of revolutionary legality, against anyone who in any way disagreed with Stalin, against those who were only suspected of hostile intent, against those who had bad reputations," end quote. He further decried the lack of due process given to these accused enemies of the people by Stalin's regime, stating, quote, "On the whole, the only proof of guilt actually used against all norms of current legal science was the confession of the accused himself. As subsequent probing has proven, confessions were acquired through physical pressures against the accused. This led to glaring violations of revolutionary legality and to the fact that many entirely innocent individuals who in the past had defended the party line became victims," end quote. At first, many of the delegates sat silent in shock. Stalin had defined the party for a generation. Many of them, including Khrushchev himself, owed their very positions in the party to Stalin. Though by the end of the speech, most of the delegates to the Congress were standing and applauding the speech, the denunciation of Stalinism was deeply controversial in many party circles. But these men saw which way the wind was blowing, and joined in the denunciation of Stalin and his quote-unquote excesses. It's also a misnomer to call this speech the secret speech. It was not secret, nor was it ever intended to be secret. It seems it was given the name secret speech merely because it was given during a closed session of the Congress rather than an open plenary session. Khrushchev himself ensured that copies of the speech were printed and leaked to the wider public in the Soviet Union and around the world. He wanted to signal that a new day was dawning in the USSR, that they would be abandoning the cynical dictatorship and setting out to build true egalitarian socialism, a fair and equal society that would be the envy of the world, and he wanted the people to join him. A large swath of the younger generation enthusiastically embraced Khrushchev's call for reform to bring the Soviet Union into line with its true egalitarian origins and intentions. One such young man who took the words of the secret speech to heart and enthusiastically embraced the campaign to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union was the young lawyer who had recently graduated from the law faculty of Moscow State University, Mikhail Gorbachev. When Gorbachev got his turn in power a few decades later, as we will see, he would try to take these ideas even further, transforming reform into revolution. But we're not quite there yet. Khrushchev also wanted his words translated and read in the West. He wanted to signal to Western leaders that the new Soviet Union was ready to de-escalate the Cold War and cooperate with them in good faith to peacefully coexist. Much to Khrushchev's dismay, however, events were already beginning to unfold in Hungary that would undermine his efforts to thaw relations with the West. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the Blake Annex for the use of this wonderful state-of-the-art podcast studio where this episode is being recorded. As always, I encourage you to follow and engage with the podcast on social media. Every piece of engagement we get helps to promote and grow the podcast and really helps us out. You can visit our website at www.thehistorysphere.com for links to all our social media and to get more information about the podcast. If you like what you heard and you want to support the podcast, you can support us with a monthly donation on Spotify or on Patreon. The link to our Patreon can be found on the website. If you can't afford to donate, I understand. You can also support the podcast by subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on, both of which will really help to promote us in the algorithm. The most common way people hear about podcasts is through word of mouth, so you can also support us by telling your friends. I'm grateful for all of my listeners, and this community has already grown beyond my initial expectations. The majority of you are my countrymen in the United States, spread out across 26 states, but I also have listeners in the UK, Australia, Ireland, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Egypt, Israel, and Germany. We're becoming a truly global community. I'm blown away by the support you all have shown me by tuning in week and week out to listen to me talk about history. I probably wouldn't be doing this if nobody was listening, so keep listening. It really means a lot to me. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will discuss the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and the Soviet response. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.